There are moments in everyone's life that leave traces for the rest of their lives. It is not always something big and bright, it can be simple, at first glance, events that over time begin to change everything around them. But sometimes life presents such blows that they change not only the usual course of events, but also the person himself, his perception of the world, people and himself. It always seemed to me that I lived an ordinary life. I had a loving wife, 2 children, a house, a job, and it all seemed normal. I thought happiness was something available to everyone if you worked at it, if you loved and cared for those around you. I believed in strong relationships, in working together. That if you love sincerely, love will return, but life doesn't always live up to our expectations. There are times when we don't see the cracks growing in something that can't seem to fall apart. Sometimes we blindly believe for too long that all is well, and then, at some point, we find out that the world we have been living in is just an illusion. And that moment can be the beginning of tragedy. I want to tell you my story. It won't be a story of revenge, it won't be a story of how I became a victim or a victor. It will be a story of love turning into pain, of trust breaking down and life beginning to feel foreign. It will be a story about how hard it is to realize that all your dreams, hopes, and desires are just an illusion created by someone else. About how hard it is to forgive when you've been betrayed, and how hard it is to move forward when it feels like your whole life is ruined. My story begins with one simple morning when I went to work as usual and she stayed home. I didn't know then that my life would change that day. But now, looking back, I realize that that moment was a turning point. Moments come in many forms, and I only now realize that they can be the foundation for a new, often inevitable, path. It's been weeks since I discovered her cheating. Everything seems so unreal, like I'm in some kind of nightmare. But I'm living the nightmare. I keep getting up every morning and going to work. It's like nothing's changed, but your mind's been turned upside down. You suddenly realize you never knew the person you lived with, loved, trusted. And you don't know what to do about it. At that moment when I walked into the house, not knowing what would happen in the next moment, I was absolutely sure of one thing: I was returning to a familiar, stable life. My wife and I have always supported each other. We had our difficulties, but we always seemed to get through everything together. We had kids, a house, dreams. I believed I could be a good husband, a good father. I tried to do better every day. And her? She was there for me. I thought she was going through the same feelings, but as it turns out, I was completely deluded. And that mistake was a disaster for me. I walked into the house that afternoon as I usually did. It was about 5 o'clock in the evening. I remember feeling a little tired after the day's work. I was expecting to meet my wife, cook dinner and spend the evening with my family. And there she was, sitting on the couch, dressed in a light dress. But her gaze was strange somehow, a little tense, a little worried. It was as if she was waiting for something, but didn't know how to tell me. I set the bag on the floor and handed her the bouquets of flowers I'd bought on the way home, as I usually did when I wanted to bring a little joy into our home. Too corny. Maybe. But at that moment, I was happy in those little things. When I handed her the flowers, her look changed a bit. She tried to smile, but I sensed insincerity. I didn't realize at the time what was behind it. But now, looking back, I realize it was the moment she decided to hide something. I didn't realize right away that something was wrong. We ate dinner in silence. I tried to be normal, as usual. But something about her behavior kept bugging me. I kept trying to find an explanation for it, but I couldn't. Then, the next morning when I woke up, I felt the warmth of the house again lacking the warmth it had before. The woman I had been with for so long, who seemed to be a part of me, had become someone alien. And that's when I decided I was going to go the tried and true route anyway. We had to talk. I had to know the truth. The truth that had been hidden for so long. Then I went to her room to see what was going on. Her face was calm, but I noticed that she was avoiding looking me in the eyes. I asked her what was wrong, what was wrong? She was quiet for a moment, but then replied, I thought you would know. Those words, though not a direct confession, immediately made me wary. I felt the anxiety growing inside me. At that moment, something clicked, and I was, perhaps without realizing it myself, already beginning to suspect. What do you mean? I asked, trying not to give away my panic. You don't need to know about that. It doesn't matter, she said, as if trying to brush the subject aside, and then I realized, she had already made a decision. A decision I couldn't even think about. I didn't know what to do. What do I do? How do I survive this moment when the world that seemed stable to me was crumbling right before my eyes? With every word she said, every look she gave me, I realized that everything I thought was ours was never mine. My family, my love, my life, it was all on the verge of disappearing. I couldn't believe what was happening. It was so unexpected and painful that I didn't even know how to continue the conversation, but we did. And in the course of the conversation, I learned that she had started dating a family friend, a man she worked with. He was a coworker of hers. She admitted that they had been together for months and that the feelings were real. All this time, while I was sure we were doing well, she had been building her life with him. Those words struck me like lightning. I felt everything inside me shrink. I sat there, unable to move. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run away, but I just sat there, trying to understand what had happened, how it had happened. She told me how they started talking, how it all began, how she gradually felt that she had found in him what I had been missing. It was a stab in the heart. How could I not see it? How could I not sense that something was wrong? We were close. We shared everything, the house, the kids, our lives. And suddenly, the betrayal. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to react. I didn't know how to survive it. And in that moment, my life changed. I began to lose faith in people, in relationships, in love. Part 2, Plunging into the Dark Abyss. When she admitted that she had been cheating on me, that she had been building her life with him for a long time, I felt my whole world come crashing down. It was like a cold shower. I sat there trying to realize what I had just heard. Everything I believed in, all my ideas about family, about what she and I had been through, had turned out to be a lie. How could this have happened? All the pain I felt was so intense that I didn't know how to go on. I needed time to calm down so I wouldn't do anything I would later regret. I didn't know what to do, I didn't know where to go. She sat across from me, her face calm, but I could see she felt no remorse. It was weird. She didn't apologize. She wasn't trying to justify herself. It was hard for me to understand what was wrong with her. It was something I couldn't understand. She cheated on me. And there was nothing to it but her words and explanations. There was nothing I could do about it. As hard as it was, I needed to find the strength to deal with the situation. I knew I couldn't just forgive her. I knew that this situation would change me. I didn't know how to continue living with it, but I felt like I had to move forward somehow. No amount of trying to get back to the way things were made any sense. Everything had been destroyed. The family, the relationship, the trust, it all turned out to be a lie. The inner chaos that raged within me wouldn't let go. I could feel all the emotions that were once a part of me being displaced by something cold and alienating. Flashes of rage, feelings of humiliation, betrayal and resentment were replaced by complete paralysis. Sometimes I wanted to scream, to break something, to release a little of the pain that overwhelmed me. But in those moments, I stayed in silence, trying to keep control. I kept working, kept pretending it was business as usual. But when I came home, when we were alone together, everything started to fall apart all over again. Every time I looked at her, I saw her face, her equanimity. It was like she wasn't reliving what she'd done. Sometimes I tried to talk to her, to discuss what to do now, but every conversation was in vain. We couldn't agree. I couldn't believe she was willing to destroy everything we had. And that realization tormented me every day. But at some point, in moments of silence, when I was alone with my thoughts, I began to think that I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit back and let her get away with it. Something had to change, something had to be done, to regain the control I had lost. I thought about revenge, about how to regain my dignity. About how to make her realize that her actions would not go without consequences. But at the same time, I didn't want to become that person. I didn't want to be someone who wallows in revenge. But I guess somewhere in the back of my mind, it was already inevitable. Every day I tried to make sense of what was happening, tried to figure out what I should do. I couldn't get my life back. She was gone and I was left with an emptiness inside. Every day that emptiness got bigger and bigger. And it tormented me because I didn't know what to do. I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to get my children back, that I wouldn't be able to reconnect with them. I was afraid that everything was lost. When we talked, she still said she loved me, but I couldn't believe it. I didn't know what her feelings really were. What was left of our love if she could betray me so easily? I tried to find her within myself, to look for those sparks of love we once had. But now I didn't know what else I could do. I didn't know how to be with the woman who had destroyed everything we'd built. It was too painful. And then one day, I decided that enough suffering was enough. I started taking steps. I went to my lawyer to find out what rights I had, how to divide my assets, how to fix my relationship with my children. I realized that I needed to rebuild my life and I had to take action. I couldn't afford to stay in this quagmire, consumed by pain and despair. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I couldn't do it any other way. Time was running out, and I had to return to the real world, but despite all these steps, despite trying to regain my dignity and my life, every time I saw her face, every time I heard her voice, I felt the memories of the past come over me again, and it was hard. I couldn't forget what had happened. And that was my biggest struggle. The inner tearing feeling I was experiencing was unexplainable. I knew that I was not the same person I used to be. I had changed. And now, at some point, I had to decide how I was going to move on. Could I forgive her? Could I get our family back together, or did I need to let go and start over? A few days passed, but I still couldn't find peace. Every time I tried to let go of the events, they came back into my head with a new force, forcing me to relive them all over again. There seemed to be no place in my house that didn't remind me of what had happened. Every room, every corner, every smell, everything became a sign that she had changed me and shattered the reality I thought was right. Her words, her excuses, her calmness, all of it kept eating away at me, preventing me from acting. In her eyes, I saw no remorse, no regret. I saw nothing but emptiness. It was the worst thing to realize that the person you spent years of your life with, the person you trusted, was a stranger to you. She didn't feel guilty. She didn't care that she destroyed our family. And me? I suffered. I was literally dying inside, trying to figure out what to do now. That night, after another sleepless night, I decided I needed to get my mind off my thoughts. I couldn't stay here, immersed in these dark thoughts. I needed to get out, talk to someone, talk about what had happened, try to find a way out. I realized that if I kept digging into my feelings, I risked drowning in this swamp. After packing up, I went to my friend, John. He was one of the few people who knew about my family. He and I met often, sharing thoughts, discussing work and personal problems. John was a good listener, and I knew I could trust him. I couldn't just sit at home and tear my soul apart. I needed some relief from this heavy burden. When I arrived at his house, he was home. We immediately sat down in his living room and I started telling him everything that had happened. How she had cheated on me with a coworker. How I had witnessed something that was ruining my life. How I didn't know what to do. John listened intently, but I could see that in his eyes I could read support, but also hidden judgment. He, like many others, couldn't understand how I could let her behave like that. You have to realize that she doesn't value you. Your life, your family, is just a convenient backdrop for her own interests, John said when I stopped talking. She chose him. It's her choice. It's not your fault. The words broke through the barrier I'd been building around myself. I realized that I really needed to find the strength to move on. But how? How do I forgive what she did? How do I get over this betrayal? I understand all of that, John continued. But you need to make a decision. You can continue to suffer, to try to rebuild. But you have to realize that you have a right to a new life. You deserve better, his words echoed in my head. I thought about it. Could I really make a fresh start? Could I even forgive her and continue living with her? Or maybe I should just put it all behind me and move forward, John continued. You have to think about what you want out of life. Yes, you're in pain right now. But you have to deal with it, free yourself from that pain. And only then can you make a choice. You're not going to live in that shadow forever. I looked at him, and though his words were precise and right, I felt like I couldn't take that step yet. I needed more time to realize what I had to do. I couldn't go back to the same house where it all happened. I couldn't look her in the eye. But I couldn't walk away and leave it all behind. Time passed. I started looking for a way out. Every day was a battle with myself. I realized that no decision could bring me back to the past, but I had to choose a path that would at least give me a chance at a new life. At times I felt like I just couldn't take the pressure. I was getting further and further away from her, but at the same time I couldn't give up completely. I began to think about how I could survive this period. What I needed to do to start rebuilding my life. I couldn't just leave things the way they were. It was too painful. But every day spent in the house with her was like a trial. I wanted to scream, to run, but at the same time I couldn't. I realized that until I made a decision, this was all going to continue. I had to figure out if I could forgive her. Would I ever be able to look at her without remembering what she had done? And if I couldn't, what would I do about it? I spent a few days completely confused, trying to sort through my feelings and the decision that needed to be made. Thoughts of her cheating on me and how I knew about it kept me on my toes. I found myself increasingly on edge as I tried to drown out the anxiety. But it came back with redoubled force. It wasn't that I didn't realize what I had to do. I knew the choice lay before me. But the fear that came at the thought of breaking up was too strong. I wasn't ready to lose everything I had. But what was left when trust was broken? Each day my feelings became more complicated. I began to watch her with even more scrutiny. Strangely, I didn't want to lose her, despite everything she had done. It was an internal conflict that was tearing me up from the inside out. She kept smiling all the time, as if nothing had happened. We went on with our normal lives, as if something elusive was hanging in the air but couldn't be expressed. At some moments I felt like I had already made up my mind. I was ready to leave. But as soon as I thought about the children, the house, the fact that I'd been married to her for so many years, the doubts came back. The look on her face, a look that didn't seem to be sincere, only increased my anguish. On those nights when I lay in bed next to her, I would revisit thoughts that would never leave me. Reflections on our past, our marriage that once seemed so strong, still tormented me. We had started out young and in love. I remembered the way she looked at me, how we made plans for the future, how we dreamed of a home, of children, of a life full of happiness. We thought that happiness would last forever, and now, in the middle of the night, lying next to her, I wondered when everything changed. How had we come to this point where I began to doubt every word she said, every look she gave me? What was the point of this life if trust was broken, if love was gone? Suddenly I remembered our first meeting. She was so innocent, so sincere. Her laughter, her eyes, it was all real. I remembered those moments when we just sat together, not caring about time, not thinking about the future. We were happy. And now, years later, I couldn't believe it had all turned out to be a lie. The more I thought about it, the less clarity I had left in my head. I started looking for signs in my life that might help me figure out what I should do next. I decided to talk to a friend, John. He had always been someone I could confide in, someone who always supported me in difficult moments. When I met with him, he immediately noticed that I was out of sorts. "Something's wrong," he said, noticing my glum look. I sighed, pressing my lips together. "You're right," I replied. "It's about my wife. She cheated on me. And I don't know what to do." John listened to me carefully. He didn't judge me, he didn't say anything unnecessary. He just listened without interrupting, giving me space to express what was on my mind. "You know it's not your decision," he said at the end. "It's her choice, not yours." Those words were like a bolt of lightning. He was right, I knew it, but somehow I couldn't let go of the guilt. Somehow I felt like I should have done more to keep her from taking that step. But now it was too late. John continued, "You don't have to live with it. You have to realize that you have a right to be happy. If you feel you can forgive her and rebuild trust, fine. But if you can't, you need to move on. You deserve something more." I didn't know what to do. John's words were true, but there was still a struggle inside me. I wasn't ready to make a final decision. My thoughts kept going back to the kids. I couldn't just walk away. We were building a life together. How could I ruin it? That's when I realized I needed time. Time to figure myself out. Time to realize what I want, what I deserve. And more importantly, to realize what she deserves. I continued to ponder. And the more I tried to figure myself out, the more I felt my soul tearing up. Everything seemed so complicated. Every day I was faced with questions I couldn't find answers to. I continued to live in a house that had once been filled with happiness, but was now a place of silence and reticence. We continued to be around each other, but as if we were already strangers to each other. She still acted as if nothing had happened. She seemed to be trying to go on with her life, as if that night when I discovered her cheating hadn't happened. Sometimes I felt like she didn't even realize how much damage had been done to our marriage. I saw no remorse in her eyes, only worry and attempts to maintain the status quo. It was as if her life couldn't go on without this cozy facade she had so carefully built. I often fell asleep thinking about how she was still smiling, how she was talking to me as if nothing had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was part of some play where I was only an actor, unaware of what was going on behind the scenes. But every day I realized more and more that this was not a play, but real life. My life, which was crumbling before my eyes. One day, a few days after talking to John, I decided I had to find out the truth. The confession kept me on edge. I wanted to understand exactly what had happened between them. Why did she go through with it? What was she missing in our lives? That night when she fell asleep, I decided to look at her phone. I knew it was wrong, but in that moment it felt like the only way I could understand what was really going on. With each slide, each message I opened, I felt the pain seeping through me more and more. She hadn't just cheated on me, she had completely deceived me. The messages with him, the correspondences, the phrases that left me no room for doubt. They weren't just close, they were more than friends. I saw all the moments she hadn't told me about. I saw how she waited for his messages, how he wrote her words that I thought were ours. It was all so devastating that I felt everything inside me shrink. I was in shock. I knew I could never get over it. But was it the end? I felt that in that moment, something in me broke. My thoughts became chaotic and I realized that I could no longer stay in this prison of lies. But at the same time, I was scared. I didn't know how to act. I thought about my children, about the future. I thought about how my life would change if I made a decision that started to destroy everything we had built. As soon as I came back to reality, I felt a chill in my chest. She was awake, and I knew the conversation was inevitable. But what words would I say? How could I express everything that had happened, all these feelings that were building up in my heart? It wasn't easy for me. But I knew I couldn't live with it anymore. I could no longer allow myself to turn a blind eye to what was happening. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay when in reality there was a storm raging inside of me. She looked confused, as if nothing had happened. She tried to talk to me like she usually did, as if everything was the same as before. But I knew that wasn't true anymore. The moment I saw her, the moment she tried to smile at me, I knew I couldn't let myself believe it anymore. She had violated all my expectations, all the foundations our marriage had been built on. Is there something you want to tell me? Her voice was light as always. She didn't even realize I was going through a disaster right now. I looked at her and felt something important tearing at my chest. It was impossible to keep pretending that nothing had happened. You cheated on me, was all I could utter. My voice sounded hollow and quiet, but in it was all the pain I'd been through in the past weeks. She froze. A small shadow slipped into her eyes, but immediately she tried to hide it behind her familiar mask. But I already knew her words couldn't hide the truth. I could feel myself torn by the internal conflict. I wasn't ready, but I was ready. This moment had come, and I knew I couldn't go back to the way I was. With every word I spoke, I felt a chill creep into my heart. All the things I had been picking up piece by piece over the week seemed now to be laid out on the table, in my face. But still, when I looked at her, I saw her trying to hide behind what was left of her former appearance. She seemed to want to turn away, but she couldn't. It was like she was waiting for me to forgive her, for me to hold back my anger so that I wouldn't ruin everything completely. I didn't know what to do. My head was full of thoughts that wouldn't let me rest. I remembered all our moments. We had built a house together, organized our lives, but it turned out that none of that was important to her. I remembered her tears, her smiles that had once seemed so genuine, but now I realized there was an emptiness behind those moments. The silence in the room lingered, and I felt my breathing grow heavy. She sat across from me, not knowing what to say. There wasn't remorse in her eyes, but rather fear. Fear of losing everything she once had. Fear that I wouldn't forgive her. She was beginning to realize that everything was ruined for her. I couldn't be who I was anymore. I couldn't look at her with the same eyes. How could you? The words came out of my throat, and I couldn't stop them. I felt like they burst out from somewhere inside, like a shadow that always sat there, but I didn't notice it. How could you do this to me? She didn't answer. I saw her lips pressed together, trying to say something, but she couldn't. I wasn't waiting for her excuses anymore. I knew there was no justifiable reason for what she had done. But in that silence, I could feel her internal struggle. It wasn't just the moment she deceived me. It was the feeling that she had deceived herself. You love him, don't you? I was asking questions I didn't want answers to, but it was important for me to hear them. I knew it wouldn't be easy to stop at those questions. She looked like she didn't have the courage to admit it out loud. But I waited anyway. She couldn't answer, her gaze became more clouded, as if she was trying to hide from me. I realized that shadow in her eyes wasn't just disappointment or apology. It was her own internal struggle that she couldn't deal with. I gritted my teeth. My heart was beating with such force that I could barely breathe. I could no longer stay with her as I had before. Everything I thought was true, everything that seemed important, was now empty. She had ruined everything, and I couldn't go back to what had come before. You can't be the woman you used to be anymore, I said coldly, as if those words weren't a part of me, just a necessity that had to be said. I can't love a man who betrayed me so easily. She began to cry. These were not the tears I once loved. These tears were not sincere. They were full of regret, but not repentance. I saw her crying not because of me, but because she had lost control of her life. Those tears were her regret, but they were not directed toward me. She was only sorry that her world had shattered, and that was what was destroying me. I stood up. I couldn't sit next to her anymore. All I wanted was to get out of this hell. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I didn't know where to go, but maybe I didn't want to go anywhere with her anymore. I had to realize who I was after all of this. I wasn't who I was before. As she sat there, continuing to cry, I walked to the door and walked out. I didn't need to stay in this house. I knew that one way or another I had to move on. Including without her. It was quiet outside. The cool of the night tickled my skin and I could feel my thoughts slowly calming down. I didn't know what I was going to do tomorrow, and maybe it didn't matter. All I wanted was to feel no more pain. I stood outside, breathing in the cold air deeply, trying to clear my mind. My feet were moving, but somewhere unknown, like they didn't know what to do. I was completely confused. My mind was jumbled with thoughts. I tried to find the answer to the question I asked myself over and over again: how could she do this? How could she betray me? But inside I felt a void that could not be filled with any answers. My thoughts continued to wander, and I couldn't get them back in order. I could go home, but what would that change? Everything was ruined, and there was no turning back. I didn't want to think about what it was like for her, what she was going through. I didn't feel sorry for her. All I needed at that moment was to get rid of this feeling that I was the one who was weak, that I had been lied to and used. I didn't know what to do about it. I was walking down an empty street, not realizing where I was going. All I knew was that I needed to be far away from this place, from her face, from her eyes, from this world where everything I thought was stable and true had collapsed in an instant. It was like a movie, only this reality was far more brutal. My thoughts were interrupted by memories. And the moments when I believed in her came back into my mind. We were happy, nothing seemed to be able to ruin our happiness. I remembered how we built a future together, how she liked to plan, how she was always there for me. But now those memories, instead of bringing comfort, only made the pain worse. They made me feel like a fool because I had believed in her sincerity, in her love, all along. I kept walking, not even noticing how far I'd gotten from home. At some point I realized I didn't want to go back. Everything seemed so foreign. This house we had built together now felt like an empty, cold place. It was full of her hypocrisy and betrayal, and I couldn't go back there. But where could I be? Where could I go? I didn't know. My life, all the certainty that I knew who I was and what mattered to me, was gone, and now, on the street, all alone, I was faced with something I hadn't thought of before. How do I move on? How do I survive what had happened? There were no answers to that question. I realized that now I would have to learn to live with the fact that everything had changed. And it was going to be a long and painful process. At some point, I decided to return home. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know where else to go. With each step I took, it became more and more difficult. My head ached from the exertion and my heart clenched with pain. I could almost feel everything inside of me starting to disintegrate. With each step, with each memory, I realized more and more that this woman I loved was now a stranger to me. When I returned, the house was quiet. She was still sitting there in our shared living room. I could see her from the window as I approached the door. She was looking at me, but I couldn't figure out what she was feeling. Perhaps she was ashamed. Maybe she was scared. But I didn't care anymore. I opened the door and stepped into the room. She raised her head and looked at me. I saw something familiar in her eyes, something I hadn't noticed in a long time. It was her usual facial expression, her usual look, which before I would have taken as sincerity. But now I saw something foreign in it. I couldn't find in her eyes what had been there before. "I can't stay with you," I said, not even trying to hide my pain. My words weren't a scream, but they sounded like a sentence.